In the autumn of 1971, a career intelligence officer named Raymond Cahill walked into a decommissioned radar facility outside Tonopah, Nevada, and reportedly came face to face with a non-human entity. Not a hallucination, not a misidentified aircraft, not a psychological test. An extraterrestrial being roughly 4 feet tall with grey skin and eyes like polished obsidian. He was inside for 11 minutes. He resigned from the CIA 14 days later. He never spoke publicly about what happened, and the file the agency keeps on him, the one we know exists because of a 1994 FOIA partial disclosure, is almost entirely redacted. Almost. I want to start with something small, something that, on the surface, looks like a clerical footnote. In 1994, researcher and former Air Force signals analyst Douglas Merritt submitted a Freedom of Information Act request targeting personnel files cross-referenced with a facility designation, NV-RD-7. He wasn't looking for Raymond Cahill specifically. He was looking for anomalies in staffing patterns at remote Nevada installations during the period between 1968 and 1975. What came back, after an 18-month delay and 3 separate appeals, was a bundle of heavily redacted documents. And somewhere in that bundle, wedged between 2 completely blacked-out personnel summaries, was a single unredacted line. Contact event, NV-RD-7, October 14th, 1971, R. Cahill duration, 11 minutes. That's it. That's the whole sentence. No classification level attached to that particular line, no accompanying context, just a data point floating in a sea of black ink. Merritt told colleagues at a 1996 conference in Albuquerque that he almost skipped past it. Almost. Here's the thing about that line. The phrase contact event does not appear anywhere else in the 847 pages of partially disclosed documents from that same FOIA bundle. Not once. It's not a standard CIA designation for a debriefing. It's not a term used in signals intelligence, counterintelligence, or psychological operations, at least not in any publicly available doctrine from that era. So what is it? And that's where Raymond Cahill becomes impossible to ignore. Let me tell you what we know about the facility. NV-RD-7 was officially listed as a decommissioned radar calibration station, shut down in 1968 following what the Air Force described as a structural assessment failure. It was supposed to be empty, dark, locked, a dead installation with no active personnel, no ongoing programs, nothing of operational significance. Except that between 1969 and 1973, internal DoD logistics records again partially surfaced through FOIA, show a recurring supply chain running to coordinates that align precisely with NV-RD-7's location. Fuel, food provisions rated for extended cold weather storage, and something listed only as biological containment materials class 4. This is a supply designation that doesn't formally exist in any published military procurement catalogue from that period, a decommissioned station, getting regular deliveries of biological containment materials through a designation that officially doesn't exist. The official explanation collapses here. It collapses the moment you try to follow any of the paper trails because the paper trails simply end, not transition to a higher classification, not redirect to a parent program. They end. Cahill was dispatched to NV-RD-7 on October 14th, according to the partial disclosure. The nature of his assignment that day is unknown. His travel authorization, which should exist somewhere in motor pool or aviation records, has never surfaced. A colleague of Merritt's, a records analyst named Patricia Vance, who spent 3 years specifically hunting for it in the mid-2000s, described the experience to me in 2019 as, and I'm paraphrasing her words here, finding a photograph with the center cut out, 11 minutes. That's what the document says. Duration of contact, 11 minutes. I keep coming back to that number. Not hours, not a debriefing session. 11 minutes. Short enough to seem incidental, long enough to end a 22-year career. Now we arrive at the part of this story that I genuinely struggled with. Not because the information is implausible. I've spent enough years in this field to know that implausible is a category that deserves constant revision. I struggled with it because the source chain here is indirect, layered, and yet internally consistent in ways that are very hard to dismiss. The core account comes from a man named Gerald Foss, a retired defence contractor who claims he worked alongside Cahill on an unrelated project in early 1972, roughly 3 months after the Tonopah event. Foss, now in his mid-80s and living outside Flagstaff, Arizona, gave a recorded interview to independent researcher Clarice Odom in 2008. He had not sought out the interview. Odom had located him through cross-referencing declassified contractor rosters with Nevada operational zones. Foss says Cahill told him, unprompted, during a lunch break at a facility he's asked us not to name, what had happened at Tonopah. He said Cahill described walking into what he thought was an empty interior corridor of NV-RD-7 and finding the room already occupied, not by personnel, by something he initially couldn't process. A figure, he told Foss, small, grey, sitting, if that was even the right word, in the approximate centre of the room with no visible means of support, not hovering, not quite sitting, existing in a posture that Cahill reportedly said the human body simply doesn't make. The being did not speak. According to Foss, Cahill was very emphatic on this point. There was no verbal communication, no audible transmission of any kind. What happened instead was something that Cahill could only describe as being shown. Not told, shown, as if a sequence of information was being transmitted directly through the act of looking. What Cahill apparently saw, what he was shown in those 11 minutes, Foss says he could only relay in fragments. And here's the strangest part. Foss says Cahill wasn't distressed when he told him. He wasn't manic. He wasn't the profile of a man who'd been broken by something. He was, Foss says, preternaturally calm, like a person who has solved an equation they've been working on their whole life and found the answer both clarifying and annihilating at the same time. The being showed Cahill something about time, not in a metaphysical sense, in a structural sense, some framework or model of how time operates that was, apparently, fundamentally incompatible with the conceptual architecture Cahill had been operating within his entire life. It suggested, and I'm extrapolating here from Foss's account, not just that our understanding of time is incomplete, but that it is inverted. That our most basic assumptions about sequence, about causality, about the direction of information are, in some essential way, backwards. Foss asked Cahill what he meant. Cahill reportedly looked at him for a long moment and said, "We think we're remembering the past. We're not, and the being knew that we don't know that. I've sat with that statement for years. I keep sitting with it." 14 days after October 14th, 1971. That's when Cahill submitted his resignation. This raises a simple but critical question. Why 14 days? Not immediately, in the aftermath of whatever occurred. Not after a debriefing cycle that would typically run 30 to 60 days for an event of any classified significance. 14 days, a number that fits no standard procedural timeline in CIA operational protocol from that era. His resignation letter, obtained through a 2003 FOIA request filed by journalist and researcher Alan Brecht, contains almost a nothing. This alone is remarkable. CIA officers of Cahill's seniority, 22 years, multiple overseas postings, a commendation in 1964 that's referenced but not described in the personnel header, don't submit brief resignation letters. The institutional expectation, supported by documentation from comparable departures in that period, was a letter of substantial length, addressing ongoing responsibilities, transition protocols, program continuities. Cahill's letter is 6 sentences long, 6 sentences after 22 years. He requests the resignation be processed without delay. He makes no reference to his service. He makes no reference to his reasons. And in the final sentence, the one that Brecht flagged in a 2004 article for the Independent Research Review, He writes only, "I am no longer able to responsibly hold this position. Not I am resigning for personal reasons. Not I am retiring to pursue other interests. I am no longer able to responsibly hold this position." The language of incapacity, the language of a man who believes something has changed in him, or has been changed, that makes him unfit for the work. What did those 11 minutes do to Raymond Cahill? Here's where I need to widen the frame. Because Cahill's case, as striking as it is, does not exist in isolation. And the moment you set it beside other cases from the same period, a pattern emerges with unsettling precision. Between 1968 and 1976, at least 7 individuals with documented intelligence or defense ties, I've been able to partially verify 4, with the remaining 3 sourced through second-hand accounts that I treat with appropriate caution, resigned from their positions within 30 days of visiting facilities in the Nevada-Utah corridor under circumstances that were never formally explained. Not transfers, not retirements on scheduled timelines, abrupt departures with minimal documentation, in several cases with personnel files that show clear evidence of selective removal. Selective removal isn't speculation. When a personnel file shows continuous documentation for 20-odd years, assignments, evaluations, travel logs, and then a specific 6-month window simply doesn't exist, that absence is itself a document. Patricia Vance spent years cataloguing these voids and described them to me as someone went through these files the way you'd go through a photograph album and pulled out specific pages, not randomly, thematically. What theme? The theme appears to be contact, or something adjacent to it, something that happened at specific locations during a specific window of years, to specific categories of personnel, after which they were no longer the same professionals they had been before. The deeper you go into this network of connected absences and abrupt departures, the harder it becomes to accept the randomness hypothesis. Coincidences accumulate, then they stop being coincidences, then they start looking like procedure. Raymond Cahill left the CIA in October 1971 and moved to a property outside Taos, New Mexico. He lived there alone. He grew a small garden. He subscribed, according to his mail records, which became partially accessible after his death, to no fewer than 11 scientific journals, several of them in fields that bore no obvious relationship to his intelligence background. Theoretical physics publications, journals focused on cognitive archaeology, at least 2 dedicated to fringe linguistic theory. He was studying something. He produced no publications. He gave no lectures. He apparently maintained almost no contact with former colleagues, with the singular exception of one documented visit in 1979 from a person whose name in the records appears only as an initial B.K., and whose connection to Cahill is listed only as professional acquaintance, prior service. Who was K? The silence around that question is, in its own way, deafening. Cahill died in 1987. Cause of death listed as cardiac failure. He was 61 years old. His property was handled by a cousin in Albuquerque. His papers, according to the cousin, who spoke briefly with researcher Clarice Odom in 2010, were claimed within a week of his death by individuals who identified themselves as representatives of a government office she couldn't later confirm existed. His papers were taken. Before anyone had catalogued them, before any independent researcher had access. 7 days after his death, they were gone. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. I want to return to the entity itself because I think we've been too quick to move past it. The description Cahill gave Foss, grey skin, approximately 4 feet in height, eyes described as large and entirely dark, aligns broadly with what has come to be called the grey typology. This is significant not because the typology validates the encounter, but because of its directionality. The grey archetype as a cultural phenomenon was not yet dominant in 1971. It crystallized in the popular imagination largely through the 1980s and 1990s. In 1972, when Cahill described this being to Foss, he was not drawing from a cultural script that widely existed. This raises a question that I find genuinely difficult to root around. If Cahill were confabulating, constructing a false memory, or deliberately fabricating an account, why would the description precede the cultural template it supposedly borrowed from? Fabricators borrow, they work from available material. In 1972, this material was not widely available. There is also the question of what the being communicated and how. Foss was careful to distinguish between what Cahill claimed was shown to him and what was said to him. The distinction seemed to matter greatly to Cahill. No words, no sounds, a transmission that bypassed language entirely. What kind of intelligence communicates that way? And if it does, what does that suggest about the nature of the information being transmitted? Information that apparently required no shared linguistic framework, no common symbolic system, nothing that we would recognize as a medium of exchange. The evidence suggests something much larger than a brief, strange encounter in a Nevada corridor. It suggests a communication technology, or perhaps a communication biology, so fundamentally different from our own that even receiving it, passively, involuntarily, was enough to restructure how a 22-year intelligence veteran understood his own existence. Here's what haunts me most about the Cahill case. He had 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes something was transmitted to him. A framework, a model, a glimpse, however partial, of how a non-human intelligence understands time, reality, information itself. And then he spent 16 years alone in New Mexico, reading theoretical physics journals and cognitive archaeology papers, apparently trying to reverse engineer what he'd been shown, trying to find the human conceptual vocabulary that came closest to whatever the being had deposited in him, trying to build a bridge from the inside between two radically different architectures of understanding. And then he died, and his papers were taken. And whatever bridge he might have been building, whatever partial translation he might have achieved in 16 years of solitary study, disappeared with them. Is that not an extraordinary thing to sit with? Not the contact itself, not the alien, not even the cover-up if that's what it was, but the loss. The specific, irreplaceable loss of one human mind's 16-year attempt to make sense of 11 minutes with something that was not human. How many times has this happened? How many individuals across how many decades have had some fragment of non-human knowledge deposited in them through contact, through encounter, through means we haven't even begun to properly categorize, and then carried that fragment in silence and then died, and then had whatever they managed to understand quietly collected by people who made sure it went no further? What do we actually know collectively about the nature of time, about the structure of consciousness, about what sequence really means, and how much of what we should know, how much of what has perhaps been directly communicated to us by intelligences operating on entirely different principles, has been systematically lost, collected, contained? Raymond Cahill walked into a room in Nevada in 1971 and came out 11 minutes later, a different kind of person. We don't know what he saw with precision. We don't know what was shown to him or how or why him specifically. We don't know what he concluded in 16 years of quiet, solitary study in the New Mexico desert. We don't know what was in his papers. We know the papers are gone. We know the file exists. We know the line that wasn't supposed to be unredacted was unredacted. And we know that somewhere in the distance between what was transmitted to Raymond Cahill in 11 minutes by a being with obsidian eyes and no discernible language, and what was quietly removed from a dead man's house in the autumn of 1987, there is a question that no official document has ever come close to answering. Not what the CIA knew, not what the being intended, not even what Cahill believed by the end. No. The question is simpler and more devastating than any of those. What did we lose? And is it already too late to ask?